much for the opportunity to present today. I'm thrilled to join you for your annual meeting. Sorry it's not in person. I would have really enjoyed getting to meet some of you. I'd also like to thank the conference organizers for considering this topic. I'd also like to give them some credit because this was before the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others in the last year, and before the large conversation we're having as a country around systemic racism. And that's because in perinatal work and the clinical work we all do, we observe these disparities in birth outcomes by race in this country. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Herson Burris. I'm a neonatologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Did a lot of my training in Philly first, and then moved to Boston for fellowship and stayed on for a number of years. And recently returned to Philadelphia to study birth outcome disparities and work toward improving perinatal health equity. So today we'll talk about racial disparities in birth outcomes and considering the environment beyond the hospital walls as a potential place to intervene. I have no conflicts of interest. We do have some funders for our work. And I start all of my talks now with gratitude. I have great mentors in Philadelphia, Scott Lorch and Michal Elevitz. And I work with an amazing team of colleagues, mentees, students, and we are all on the same mission to understand and improve birth outcomes and rectify inequity. So the first goal of my talk is to really understand what is meant when we say that race is a social construct in the United States, as opposed to some innate biologic construct. And once we do that, we can work toward health equity. We'll talk about infant mortality statistics, preterm birth rate statistics, and then we'll talk about recognizing some environmental factors that may be explanations for the disparities we see and potentially targets for intervention. So we know that Black infants are more than twice as likely to die in the first year of life compared to white infants. The infant mortality rate in the United States is about 6 per 1,000 live births. Among Black infants, it's almost 11, and among white infants, it's less than 5. Black infants make up just 15% of all births, but 29% of all infant deaths. And when we look at the 5 leading causes of death in the United States, we can see there are racial disparities in each of these, which are the purple bars. The largest disparities are with preterm birth-related mortality, as well as pregnancy complications. So what is preterm birth-related mortality? Well, it's the second leading cause of death in infants. It makes up about 17% of all infant mortality. It's the second leading cause overall, but the first leading cause among Black infants, and it makes up about 22% of all the infant deaths among Black infants. There were more Black infants that died from preterm related mortality than white infants in the most recent year's data. And this is striking again because Black infants only make up 15% of all births, whereas white infants make up 50%, a little over 50% of all births. And this is because there are huge disparities in preterm birth rates. So whether we look at preterm birth, which is less than 37 weeks completed gestation, extremely preterm birth, low birth weight, or very low birth weight, there are racial disparities in all of these outcomes. A lot of the previous research focused on individual risk factors, genetics, education, smoking, interpregnancy interval, and prenatal care. And I'm going to explain why each of these is insufficient to explain the differences in birth outcomes by race in this country. Let's start with genetics. I think this is a hard thing for a lot of biomedical folks to kind of get our heads around, which is that there are diseases that have racial disparities that are due to genetics, okay? But these conditions are extremely rare and are not the most, there are disparities in all sorts of outcomes. And these single gene mutation diseases in which we observe racial disparities, I think have kind of shaped our view about why there are racial disparities and kind of overemphasize the genetics. But I like to think about health along a continuum from genetic all the way to environmental as the reason for a health outcome. So let's think about these diseases that are strictly genetic, and thus when there is a racial disparity, it is strictly genetic. So these are your single gene mutations: sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, Gaucher's disease, right? So sickle cell disease is more common among Black Americans because there's this one particular gene that's passed along over multiple generations. Cystic fibrosis, similarly. And then Gaucher's disease is only really seen usually in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. So these are the entirety of the racial disparity or the ethnic disparity you see is going to be due to genetics, one gene. We move along the continuum into other disorders like cancer. And sometimes there are particular genes that really change their susceptibility to getting cancer. And we think about this with BRCA1 mutations. So white Jewish women are more likely to have BRCA1, and they're more likely to have that particular cancer. And so when there is a racial disparity in a very particular cancer that has a very particular gene mutation, you're going to end up with a genetic cause. But then there are lots of other cancers and breast cancers that have more of an environmental component or multiple genes involved. And then when we look at when you have more than one cause, genetics is less likely to be the reason for the population-based differences you see. And we really see that when it comes to all these other disorders where we see racial disparities. So Black children are more likely to have asthma, Black adults are more likely to have hypertension, and Black pregnant women are more likely to have preterm birth. But there is not one particular gene that is responsible for each of these conditions. And these conditions result a lot from environmental factors. We know this from preterm birth, right? So we know that smoking is a big risk factor for preterm birth. That's not necessarily genetic. We think about hypertension. Hypertension could be, it's also a very, very heterogeneous disorder, meaning that not just the causes, but the actual disease itself could be really different. So you could have hypertension that is mainly renal in origin, right? We see that in our preterm babies who have hypertension because their kidneys got injured during their prematurity or didn't grow properly postnatally or in utero. Or it could be that you have hypertension because you have big plaques from your hyperlipidemia in your 50s, right? So hypertension is a really messy disorder, and preterm birth is like that too, right? Preterm birth can be because you show up with your water broken at 28 weeks, or it could be that you have a headache and you're found out to have preeclampsia. And those are really different pathophysiologic states that lead to the same outcome of preterm birth. So you're not going to find one gene that's responsible for preterm birth. And so when you don't have that kind of single gene construct, the population level differences between kind of self-identified racial groups is not going to be the main contributor to the disorder that you see. Okay, and this is in the most extreme way happens with entirely environmental disorders. So we think about gun violence or car wrecks or work-related injuries, right? So we could take the work-related injuries for a moment. If we think about if fishermen in Alaska are entirely white men, then when white men are more likely to die of fishing accidents in the United States, that's not due to some genetic construct, right? That was the exposure to that particular job. And so I think we can all agree that that's entirely environmental. And so I would put preterm birth way over here. Are there some small genetic contributions to preterm birth within populations? Perhaps, right? There's some data to support that. But those genes don't necessarily track with populations. And even the folks that study genetics of preterm birth will tell you that the larger contributor is environmental disorders or environmental exposures, I should say. And so we're going to put it over here. And so we'll talk about what this means. So with respect to genetics, it's not just my kind of continuum that is the reason that we believe this. The data support this as well. So this was a paper that rocked, I think, perinatology, neonatology in 1997. It was in the New England Journal. Here it's by Richard David and Jimmy Collins. You can see along the x-axis is birth weight, and on the y-axis is the proportion of all births. And you can see nearly overlapping birth weight distributions among Black infants born to African-born Black women who had their babies in Illinois, and US born white infants born to US born white mothers. However, you can see this substantial shift to the left, and this is Black infants born to US born Black women. And so what we know from this is that being Black in the US for at least a generation was something about that was driving lower birth weights among Black infants. When we look at preterm birth, this is Elo and al.'s work. You can, from data from 27 states, more recent data, looking at preterm birth rates, you can see that US-born Black women also have a higher rate of preterm birth than foreign-born Black women. And even when they adjusted for all the important confounding variables, this association persisted with foreign-born Black women in the US having lower rates of preterm birth. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you it's not going to be genetics that will solve this problem. What about socioeconomic status? That's usually the next thing we think about. Well, unfortunately, I don't think education alone is going to solve this problem. And that's because of these data. These are data I pulled from CDC Wonder. You could play with those data too, it's freely available. But here I've restricted this to college-educated women in the purple bars and women who dropped out of high school or didn't complete high school in the green bars, and we've stratified this by race. And we can see that indeed, women who do not graduate from high school have higher preterm birth rates, regardless of race. But what's really notable is that Black women who graduate from college have higher preterm birth rates than white women who do not graduate from high school. And so solving education alone won't eliminate racial disparities in birth outcomes. What about smoking? We talked about that as one of the ways that we know that preterm birth is not so strictly genetic. And indeed, smoking is a big risk factor for preterm birth, but not that many women smoke luckily in the United States anymore. However, women who do smoke have higher rates of preterm birth, regardless of race, but fewer Black women smoke in the US compared to white women. And white smokers have lower preterm birth rates than Black non-smokers. Let that kind of sink in for a little bit. So even if everyone were to stop smoking, we wouldn't resolve racial disparities in preterm birth. All right, what about interpregnancy interval? Well, we know that if you lengthen the time between pregnancies, there's a lower risk of preterm birth. And Dr. Hogue and all did a nice study where they kind of modeled what the difference would be if everyone were to magically have appropriate or ideal, I guess I should say ideal interpregnancy interval. So between the time they deliver their last baby and get pregnant with the next baby, if that were to all magically become at least 18 months, you might see the preterm birth rate among Black women go from about 14% to about 13%. And among white women, it might go from 9.1% to 8.7%. But when I did the math using their data, that would mean that the Black-white risk ratio would go from 1.53, so 53% increased risk of preterm birth among Black women compared to white women, down to 48% increased risk. So that's still looking a lot like 50% increased risk, and so it will not kind of solve the problem alone. Can hurt, but it won't solve the problem. All right, what about prenatal care? And I think as physicians and nurses, nurse practitioners, we all think, what if we optimize prenatal care? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard faculty or staff talking about, oh yeah, that baby was born early, she had scant prenatal care, as if that was gonna solve the problem. And I think that indeed the lack of prenatal care is more of a marker of risk necessarily than the reason that a woman delivers early. And the reason I say that is that we're not that good at preventing preterm birth, right? Our progesterone interventions are questionable. I mean, cerclages, as you see, are not highly successful. And so we're not that good at preventing preterm birth. I think the obstetricians would love to be great at preventing preterm birth, but they're not yet. And so prenatal care is unlikely to solve this. This is a fellowship study by Wanda Barfield, who's now a really well-known neonatologist who works in the CDC. She, and when she's also in the military, and so when she was in fellowship, she had access to these data. And her hypothesis was, well, military women have equal access to prenatal care. What happens to their birth outcomes? Maybe the disparity is not so bad when you have everyone getting the same care. Well, it turns out that these are black-white risk ratios for moderately low birth weight and very low birth weight. And you can see that among civilian women, Black women have about 2.5 times the risk of these outcomes. But among military women, there is a decrease in the disparity. So Black women had about a 70% increased risk, or 1.7 increased risk of having moderately low birth weight infants, and 2.4 for very low birth weight. I think what this showed to me was that, yeah, there is some attenuation of the disparity, but it doesn't go away, and this is still massive. So prenatal care alone will not resolve the racial disparity. And we saw this also in Massachusetts. There was a natural experiment in 2006 where universal health care was implemented. This was the roadmap for the Obamacare health policy that was passed a few years later. And what we can see here is that before universal health care in 2005, you can see these are low birth weight rates, and the risk ratio was 1.64. And then about 10 years later, well after universal health care, the risk ratio is very similar. You can see the improvement for both groups, but the risk ratio is really unchanged. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the research that we do, which is to understand and investigate population exposures in order to ultimately understand and resolve racial disparities in preterm birth. And so we think about this expanded framework for preterm birth, which includes thinking about the individual factors, but this macro environment, the exposures to which people have a lot less control. So these are physical environmental exposures, like the air we breathe, the water we drink, the metals in our pipes, other chemicals, as well as social exposures such as discrimination or exposures to racism, neighborhood deprivation, and violence. I'm going to focus first on air pollution. So air pollution is a mixture of lots of exposures. I'm going to focus for this talk on PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that's smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. This is a grain of sand, so these are really tiny. They're so tiny that when we breathe them in, they can cross right over our pulmonary epithelial barrier right into our bloodstream. And then they can go everywhere in our body, and they cause oxidative stress and inflammation, and that's how they cause things like stroke and myocardial infarction, lung disease, all cause mortality. And there is data to suggest that it's associated with low birth weight and preterm birth. And there are disparities in the exposure. So here we've gotten the x-axis time and the y-axis is exposure. We've got exposure among Black Americans in the green line and exposure among white Americans in the purple line. And while everyone's exposure has been going down due to the Clean Air Act, there are still big differences by race in this country. So why? Why would there be differences? Right, so residential segregation is a big problem, and it's been a problem for a long time. So this is a map called a Homeowners Loan Corporation map, or a HOLC map, from 1937. And my research coordinator, Rachel Ledger, pointed this map out to me. So red neighborhoods were, quote, redlined. And these neighborhoods were deemed to be less desirable for lending. And so this was right after the Depression. It was the New Deal. And the government put forth this program to try to improve people's chances of not foreclosing on their mortgage. And in order to figure out like the risk of loaning humans this money, these neighborhoods were deemed desirable for lending, like the green neighborhoods. And then next grade was blue, yellow was kind of on the fence, and red was too risky for lending. And it turned out when people looked at these neighborhoods, even if they were completely equal when it came to income and education, if they were more likely to be Black neighborhoods with like higher proportion of Black residents, they were redlined. And so there was this unfair, unjust lack of investment that happened solely on the basis of race for these neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods did not thrive as well. The homes kind of fell into disrepair in a lot of places, and industry would move in and pollute, and there wasn't enough kind of community ability to fight those exposures that were happening within neighborhoods. Lack of economic resources. And here are the two hospitals where I work in Philadelphia, or our group works. This is the Hospital University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia, and this is Pennsylvania Hospital. And you can see we're right kind of near a lot of the redlined areas. And we study the births at our hospital. So this is Penn Medicine. We call the birth cohort GeoBirth. It's about 9,000 births a year in the two hospitals. It's majority Black, and about 51% of all the births in Philly happen at these hospitals. And then we perform manual chart review of every single preterm birth. And that's because of this really heterogeneous outcome that I talked about. You know, women can come in and say, I think I'm in labor, I'm having contractions. They're given some IV fluids. They're found not to be in preterm labor, but let's say they're found to be hypertensive and have protein in their urine and are delivered for preeclampsia. The chief complaint of contractions might kind of track through the medical system. And if we just use billing codes, we can be misled and think that that was a spontaneous preterm birth when in fact that was medically indicated. And our hypothesis is that not every environmental exposure will have the exact same impact on each of these outcomes. And so it's important to get good precision on the outcomes. That's what we do. And then we link each woman's address in the year prior to delivery to link her home to the area level environmental exposures that can vary in space and time. So air pollution and other exposures like violence. So here's GeoBirth, and we can see that it's majority non-Hispanic Black, and that, as we might expect, Black women are overrepresented among women who deliver spontaneously preterm or medically indicated preterm. This is just a couple of years of data, 2013 to 17 at one of the sites. And then we can see it's also highly there's a high proportion of Medicaid insurance. And preterm birth and GeoBirth looks a lot like it does in the country. And you can see that Black women have higher rates than white women and other women. I collaborate with Dr. Alan Just at Mount Sinai in New York to assign air pollution exposures to each of the women in GeoBirth. Now, Dr. Just's algorithm is really pretty awesome. So what he does is he uses data, publicly available data from the Environmental Protection Agency monitors, where say there are 20 monitors in Philly. Then he uses those monitors as well as NASA satellite data, and he creates a model where he can predict what the ground level air pollution is. So let's say monitor 3. Say monitor 3 says that the air pollution level is 5 today. And so he says, okay, we know monitor 3 is 5, but I'm going to pretend I don't know that. I'm going to use all the other monitors, and I'm going to use NASA satellite data, and I'm going to try to predict what monitor 3 was today. And he tunes that model and he perfects that model until that model tells him that what he knows, which is the truth, or as close to it as possible, which the level was 5. Okay, and then he does it for all the other monitors so that he can get a better and better prediction for each of those ground monitors. And then he can use that model to predict what the ground level air pollution is every single day, even where there's not a monitor. He uses all the other features or the other pieces of information that he has in his model to detect what, or to predict what the pollution is right here where there might not be a monitor. So what about pollution and redlining? So I showed you this whole map, and I've tipped it a little bit so that it would be kind of more in line. You can see this straight line and this straight line and this line and this line. For any of you who've been in Philadelphia, this is City Line Avenue. And what you can see is these redlined areas are also areas of high pollution to this day. And Black women in Philly still have higher air pollution exposures than white women in Philadelphia, or at least in GeoBirth. And we can see this by about a half a standard deviation. When it comes to air pollution and birth outcomes in GeoBirth, in this pilot that we ran, you can see that while there's slightly higher exposures among women who deliver preterm compared to term, that is not statistically significant. However, when we stratify out the outcome by the actual phenotype here, the spontaneous versus medically indicated preterm birth, we can see that really it's because there's an association with spontaneous and not with medically indicated. So this is an association we would have missed had we not done the phenotyping. And when we do adjusted models, we see the exact same thing, which is that the entirety of the air pollution preterm birth association is driven by spontaneous preterm birth. And then, you know, the first model is adjusted for race, but sometimes people still think that there's confounding by race. Even when we stratify out and look at just Black women, we see very similar effect estimates, such that Black women with higher air pollution have higher risks of spontaneous preterm birth, or odds, I should say, in this. And so we conclude from this that regardless of race or ethnicity, air pollution is associated with spontaneous preterm birth in this cohort. Let's go back to our expanded framework and think about a social exposure, another physical environmental exposure that might be associated with social class. And this is neighborhood deprivation. So Cole Brokamp is in Cincinnati, and he developed an index that ranges from 0 to 1. And he found that neighborhoods that have higher deprivation, that's associated with increased healthcare utilization in the first year of life. So we applied his model to Philadelphia. So these are census tract level variables. And we applied the index to everybody in GeoBirth. So this index is made up of a number of variables: poverty indicators, lack of health insurance, the proportion of humans in the census tract, not our patients, but the neighborhood education level, and then the proportion of vacant homes. So this is right near where I went to medical school in Temple in North Philadelphia. This neighborhood would have a high neighborhood deprivation index. And in GeoBirth, Black women have higher levels of neighborhood deprivation than white women by about 2 standard deviations. This is a really big difference. When we look at neighborhood deprivation in association with preterm birth, we see that the association is pretty stable across the phenotypes. So in this case, it didn't matter that we stratified out the outcome. But when we restrict, I should say, when we restrict to Black women, we see very similar estimates. So we conclude here that regardless of race, neighborhood deprivation is associated with preterm birth. Well, what if you have both air pollution and a physical and a social environmental exposure, like neighborhood violence? And Philadelphia is a good place to do this type of work because there are areas that have high pollution and high violence, and there are areas that have high pollution and low violence, and there are areas with lower pollution and higher violence, and so we're able to make comparisons. We can see that about 1/4 of women in GeoBirth live in areas of high violence and high air pollution, and a little under 1/4 live in areas that are low in both. And then you can see the remainder of women have exposure to high levels of one of the exposures. Black women have 40% of Black women lived in census tracts that were high in both exposures, compared to just 10% of white women in GeoBirth. So they were 4 times more likely to live in these high exposure areas. And when we look at preterm birth, we can see that there's higher risk of preterm birth when you live in high areas, the high level of areas, compared to low for all participants, as well as when you look just among Black women. So again, regardless of race or ethnicity, the combination of high air pollution and high violence was associated with preterm birth. How might environmental exposures lead to preterm birth and associated disparities? Feel free to put them in the chat if you'd like. Well, we looked at one potential mechanism. So Dr. Elovitz, one of my mentors, she has a grant from the NIH, from the Institute of Nursing Research, in which she analyzed the cervical vaginal microbiome in association with spontaneous preterm birth. And she found that the CST4, or community state type 4, which has very few lactobacillus, so if I allow me to simplify for a moment, few good bacteria and lots of bad bacteria, had higher risk of spontaneous preterm birth. So we call that the high risk cervical vaginal microbiota. So that high risk cervical vaginal microbiota is associated with spontaneous preterm birth. It's also more common among Black women. And I think for a long time, people thought that was just the way it was, that just Black women have a higher risk of this microbiome that has a lot of bad bacteria. But we questioned that. We wondered if maybe that was because of all of the different exposures that happen because of racism in this country and redlining and all of the things I mentioned. Again, questioning race as some sort of innate biologic construct and more likely a result of cumulative exposures. And so first we looked at whether air pollution were associated with this cervical-vaginal microbiota. And indeed, they found higher air pollution was associated with this high-risk cervical-vaginal microbiota. And when we restrict to Black women, we see the same thing. And so regardless of race, air pollution was associated with a high-risk cervical-vaginal microbiota. Similarly, when we looked at neighborhood deprivation, we saw the same thing. So neighborhood deprivation is associated with this high-risk cervical-vaginal microbiota, adjusted for all of our confounding variables, including race. And when we restrict to just Black women, we see the same association. So regardless of race, neighborhood deprivation is associated with a high-risk cervical-vaginal microbiota. So maybe we can quantify quantify that question that we have around whether this is some inherent difference when it comes to microbiota by race, or whether this is really environmental. And we're just looking at one environmental exposure here. So we decided to do something called causal mediation analysis. The first thing we did was look at the distribution of neighborhood deprivation and race in this cohort, this motherhood and microbiome cohort. So on the x-axis, remember, low being 0, neighborhood deprivation, high being closer to 1. The highest it looks like we got here is 0.8. And we can see this is where Black women tend to live, and this is where white women live. You can see really different patterns. However, there's enough overlap here that we can do this causal mediation analysis. In this graph, we see the mean neighborhood deprivation on the y-axis, and these are all participants. And then the red dots are women with the high-risk cervical vaginal microbiota, and the blue or grayish dots are women with all the other low-risk microbiomes. So lots of good bacteria. More bad bacteria or good bacteria. And we can see this big difference by neighborhood deprivation. And then we look among Black women, we see the same pattern, maybe a little attenuated, but the same pattern. And then we look among non-Black women and we see the same pattern. Again, smaller numbers here, which is why you have the wider confidence intervals, but definitely it's different. So the way we used to do causal mediation analysis, or mediation, like how much does a variable explain the difference you see, is we would add it to a model. So here, this is a model of Black race as the exposure, and the outcome is high-risk cervical vaginal microbiota, right? The bad bacteria. And you can see that Black women in this cohort have about twice the odds of this high-risk cervical vaginal microbiota in adjusted models. If we then add in neighborhood deprivation, you see that's majorly attenuated. So race becomes a lot less important once we add neighborhood deprivation. But this doesn't actually tell us whether these two numbers are actually different from each other. And so in order to do that, we do this fancier causal mediation analysis, which allows for confounding structures and interactions among all the variables, the exposure with the mediator with the outcome. So it's just a fancy way to actually kind of say how much of the race microbiome relationship might be explained by this difference in neighborhood deprivation. And it turns out it's about 28% of the race microbiota relationship may be explained by neighborhood deprivation, which is just one environmental exposure. Imagine if we add on other environmental exposures or modifiable factors, how much of this might be kind of washed away, and maybe there was no difference, ultimately inherent difference by race when it comes to the microbiome. And I would argue that if I had to put money in Vegas on this, I would say that that's the case. If you just, had everyone have the same kind of exposures from conception to the time that you're pregnant and we're measuring your microbiota, I bet we would see almost no difference by race ethnicity. So this supports this concept of race in the United States as a social construct. yes, it has health implications, but that's because of all of the exposures that have come from not just interpersonal racism, but life in general that has resulted from differences of lived experiences. How much you worry when you're driving that you're going to get even pulled over. How much do you worry about the health and safety of your children? Um, how much do you worry about the quality of your schools? How much, I mean, the exposures are endless in terms of the difference by race in this country. And measuring biomarkers like the microbiome, that when we find differences by race, that doesn't necessarily provide us evidence for some sort of intrinsic genetic difference by race. However, I still think these biomarkers can be helpful because potentially they can motivate policy to improve physical environments, right? So once we find the biologic mechanism or link between an environment and an outcome, if we can somehow modify that, whether it's with green space exposure or better housing or air and water quality, potentially we can intervene and affect the mediator and improve outcomes. And you know, I earlier said that education won't solve the problem, and it's true, alone it will not solve racial disparities in outcome, but education is a powerful tool, not just for individual health, but for the health of communities. So the ability to recognize what's happening in your community and then be able to communicate with the humans that hold power in terms of resources in the city, or enforcing rules around industrial pollution nearby. I mean, there is an entire environmental justice program because of the differential exposures to toxicants by privilege in this country, right? So where I live, there would not be some industrial wasteland right next to my house. The neighbors in the entire community would never allow that to happen. They would use every single lever they had to make sure that that didn't happen. And so education can be a way for people to be able to lobby and improve neighborhoods for communities. So we come back to our conceptual framework, where racism's up here, the upstream variable, that then affects income inequality and residential segregation, like the Hulk maps I showed you. This, where you live and how much money you make, affects where you go to school and what you learn. And so there's a cycle here that needs to be broken if we're going to be serious about health equity. Racism can lead directly to psychosocial stress, but all of this can lead to psychosocial stress too. Residential segregation, and to be fair, workplace segregation can also affect toxic environmental exposures. As I've shown you, these two things can interact, so high levels of exposure to psychosocial stressors and environmental toxicants can combine and really lead to differential health outcomes, including preterm birth and birth outcome disparities by race in this country. So what does this mean for neonatal providers? Well, first, it's almost never an individual's fault that an infant is born sick. There are rare exceptions to that, but people can do everything right and still have a terrible health outcome, as you know, we all know. And people can do everything wrong and have a perfectly healthy outcome. We need to see pregnancy and birth outcomes as a kind of an accumulation of all of the exposures that came before, and really get blame out of the story. The observed increase among Black families we see about in landing in the NICU is a result of generations and lifetimes of exposures that accumulate and result in increased adverse pregnancy outcomes. And solving this problem within the hospital walls, prenatal care, telling people to stop smoking is not going to be enough. We're going to need a societal movement to address this and rectify inequities in perinatal health. And I think as our jobs as people who can communicate intelligently about this, it's important to share that knowledge and to advocate for healthy environments for everyone. And in particularly, yes, I'm biased for pregnant women. Imagine clean air, clean water, decreasing stressors, exposure to green space. All of those things can only help, but they need to be not just during pregnancy, but for the lifetime that led up to the pregnancy and ultimately the birth. So I'd like to end my talk again with gratitude and with my team members, and I'm really, really looking forward to your questions, and feel free to reach out after the meeting if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share. Thanks.